It was Pentecost Sunday, and as the congregation filled the church, the ushers gave each person a bright red carnation to symbolize the festivity of this celebration. The people listened very attentively to the reading of the Pentecost story from the book of Acts, about how the disciples had heard what sounded like a powerful wind from heaven, about how the Holy Spirit had appeared like tongues of fire. And then came the sermon. "The Spirit of the Lord is upon us," the preacher began. And from the front pew, a woman shouts out, "Like a powerful wind from heaven." And then she threw a carnation at the altar. And the preacher began again. "The Spirit of the Lord is upon us." And the same woman's voice rang out, "Like tongues of fire, like tons of fire." And she threw another red carnation at the altar. And so the preacher looked straight at her and said to her, "Now throw me your pocketbook." To which the woman replied, "Preacher, you just done calm that wind and put out that fire." Strong wind, tongues of fire. Certainly not about money, but about strong winds and tongues of fire that gave the early apostles the courage and the convictions to move beyond the sadness of losing the physical presence of Jesus. It moved them to a re-engagement with the world in order to spread the message of Jesus. In a 2007 edition of Newsweek, author and radio personality Garrison Keillor was asked to choose what he considered to be the 5 most important books. Surprisingly, he ranked the book of Acts as one of the most important, the top of his list. And when describing the book of Acts, Keillor offered this concise but very potent summation. He wrote, "The flames lit on their little heads, and bravely and dangerously went they onward." Bravely and dangerously went they onward. That's the challenge of Pentecost. No matter what we face in life, we are called to confront our challenges bravely and dangerously. And our God gives us the promise that the Spirit will be with us to embolden us. And this applies to each and every one of us in this church. It applies to married couples who are challenged to go bravely and dangerously in a world where marriage is extremely hard work and family life is threatened today in so many different ways. It applies to religious leaders who are challenged to go bravely and dangerously in a world where secularism is the new God, and more of our younger people are calling themselves part of the none generation, N-O-N-E. They belong and commit to nothing. It's about political leaders who are challenged to bravely and dangerously move forward in a world that's overwhelmed by partisanship and greed. It's about our teachers, our educators, our medical healers, who are challenged to move forward bravely and dangerously in a world that is so complicated by racial bigotry, violence, greed, entitlement, narcissism. Bravely and dangerously. This is what Pentecost is all about. I believe, and I believe you would agree with me, that we live in a time in history where indifference and apathy will destroy us. Pentecost calls us to meet bravely the danger that's around us. It was February 3rd of 1977, and a highly conservative gentleman by the name of Oscar Romero was appointed Archbishop of San Salvador. And when he was appointed, he was very suspicious of the church's involvement in political activism. Romero's appointment was welcomed by the government, but many of his priests were not happy at all. And they weren't happy because they suspected that their new archbishop would not defend the poor. But all this changed. It changed when Romero realized that the poor laborers waiting for work at the coffee plantations were sleeping on the sidewalks. It was then that he became brave in a very dangerous world, and he asked the question. He said to his people, "What can be done?" And they told him. One said to him, "Look at that big house where the school used to be. Open that up." And Romero did. And next, he started talking with those poor workers. He began to understand their problems. But he still had difficulty. He had real difficulty believing the claims that the plantation workers treated the plantation owners treated the workers unjustly. So he was told by his people, "Well, why don't you go to that plantation of your friend? Go find out for yourself." And he did. He found out, and he couldn't believe that so much injustice was possible. But the most important event affecting Romero's decision to wholeheartedly stand with the poor and the oppressed was the assassination of his very close friend, Jesuit Father Retiro Grande, who was promoting land reform and worker unions and organizing communities to have a greater voice regarding their own lives. Romero made this statement. He said, "When I looked at Retiro lying there dead, I thought, if they have killed him for doing what he did, then I too have to walk the same path." So during his March 23rd, 1980 radio homily, national radio homily, he had the courage to say this. He said, "I would like to make an appeal in a special way to the men of the army. You kill your own campesino brothers and sisters. The law of God must prevail that says, 'Thou shalt not kill.' No soldier is obliged to obey an order against the law of God. In the name of God and in the name of this suffering people, whose laments rise to heaven each day more tumultuously, I beg you, I ask you, I order you, in the name of God, stop the repression." The very next day, he stood at the altar, celebrating the Eucharist at the hospital compound where he lived, and they shot him to death. Today in Rome, Francis has called him officially Blessed Oscar Romero, on the road to sainthood. But for the people of Central America, especially the poor and the oppressed, he is already their saint, because he did become brave in a very, very dangerous world. Probably none of us will be asked to make that kind of sacrifice, but each one of us is asked to be brave in a dangerous world, whether it be in marriage or family life, whether it be in the life of the church, in the political world, in the classroom, in the hospital, as a police officer or a fire officer, a worker in a factory, a CEO. Pentecost challenges you and me not to be indifferent or passive in a world that is crying out for brave and dangerous leadership. And so this weekend, as a church, we sing, "Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of the faithful with a powerful wind and tongues of fire."